Hello and welcome. You've just stepped into a deep dive through the entire history of the United States, from the earliest days to the modern era. I'm Tired Historian, here to guide you through this vast and fascinating journey, sharing facts, events, and stories without distractions or heroes, just pure history. Get ready for a detailed, no-nonsense exploration of how the USA came to be. Let's begin. Before the territory was known as the United States of America, it was inhabited by numerous indigenous peoples, each with distinct languages, customs, and ways of life. These groups included the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Sioux, the Navajo, and many others. They developed complex societies with varying degrees of sedentary agriculture, hunting, fishing, and trade. The Mississippian culture, for instance, constructed large earthen mounds and maintained extensive trade networks. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built intricate dwellings in cliffs and developed irrigation systems to support agriculture in arid regions. European contact began in earnest in the late 15th century, although Norse explorers may have arrived centuries earlier. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, initiating a wave of European exploration and colonization. The Spanish established a presence in what is now the American Southwest and Florida. By the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadors and missionaries had begun moving north from Mexico, establishing missions and settlements in areas that would later become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Meanwhile, the French explored the interior regions of the continent via the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes, focusing primarily on fur trading. In 1608, they founded Quebec and gradually established alliances with various Native American tribes. The English began colonizing the eastern seaboard in the early 17th century. The first permanent English settlement was established in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. The early years were marked by high mortality, conflict with native groups, and economic hardship. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts. They were followed by waves of Puritans seeking religious freedom. The Massachusetts Bay Colony quickly grew in population and became a hub of colonial governance and religious orthodoxy. Over time, more colonies were founded, including Maryland, 1634, Rhode Island, 1636, Connecticut, 1636, and Pennsylvania, 1681. These colonies were founded for a variety of reasons, including religious freedom, economic opportunity, and political autonomy. Throughout the 17th century, the English, Dutch, and French vied for control over North American territory. The Dutch established New Netherland with its capital at New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City. However, in 1664, the English seized the colony and renamed it New York. The European presence had a devastating impact on Native American populations. Diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles spread rapidly, decimating entire communities. Colonists also displaced indigenous people from their lands through war, coercion, and treaty violations. The economic systems in the colonies evolved throughout the century. In the southern colonies, plantation agriculture based on cash crops like tobacco and rice became dominant. This system relied heavily on indentured servants and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade began to supply the labor needs of the southern economy. Northern colonies developed mixed economies of farming, trade, and small-scale industry. The middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York, became centers of grain production and commerce. The colonies were nominally under the control of the English crown, but in practice they enjoyed a significant degree of autonomy. Each colony had its own legislature and governance system, often with a governor appointed by the crown and an elected assembly. Conflicts occasionally arose between governors and assemblies, particularly over taxation and control of local militias. The colonial societies began to diverge from European norms. A distinct Anglo-American culture began to emerge, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, Protestant religious practices, and the practical realities of life in the New World. Education and literacy rates were relatively high in New England due to the Puritan emphasis on reading the Bible. Harvard College was founded in 1636 to train ministers. Printing presses appeared in the colonies, and newspapers and pamphlets became popular. By the end of the 17th century, the colonies were well established, though not without conflict. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, in New England was a brutal conflict between colonists and Native American tribes, resulting in the near destruction of several indigenous communities. In the South, Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, reflected tensions between frontier settlers and colonial elites. Relations with Native Americans varied across regions and time periods. Some alliances were formed through trade and intermarriage, while other relationships were marked by warfare and displacement. The complex and shifting alliances between European powers and native tribes played a critical role in shaping the geopolitics of the continent. As the 18th century approached, the stage was set for further colonial expansion, conflict, and the eventual rise of American political consciousness. By the early 18th century, the 13 British colonies in North America had become increasingly stable, growing in both population and economic output. The population expanded rapidly due to natural increase and immigration from the British Isles, Germany, and other parts of Europe. Enslaved Africans were imported in large numbers to support agricultural labor, particularly in the southern colonies, where plantation systems dominated. In the North, towns expanded and diversified economies developed. Port cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became major centers of trade and commerce. Artisans, merchants, shipbuilders, and laborers formed the backbone of colonial urban economies. Inland, settlers pushed westward into territories still inhabited by Native American tribes, leading to further conflict and displacement. The economic structure of the colonies was shaped by the principles of mercantilism. Under British law, particularly the Navigation Acts, the colonies were expected to supply raw materials to the mother country and purchase manufactured goods in return. While these laws sought to control colonial trade, enforcement was often lax, leading to a practice known as salutary neglect. This allowed colonial merchants and smugglers to operate with relative freedom, fostering a sense of economic independence. Religion continued to play an important role in colonial life. The First Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals in the 1730s and 1740s, swept through the colonies, emphasizing personal religious experience and challenging the authority of established churches. Evangelical preachers attracted large audiences and new denominations emerged, including Baptists and Methodists. The movement contributed to a growing spirit of individualism and dissent. Colonial governments became more experienced and self-reliant. Each colony had its own elected legislature, and these assemblies gained increasing control over taxation and local policy. While governors were still appointed by the crown or by proprietors, they often found themselves at odds with the legislatures, which represented the interests of landowning colonists. By the mid-18th century, tension was growing between European powers competing for control of North America. The French and British had long-standing rivalries over trade routes, fur resources, and territory. These rivalries came to a head in the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, which was the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. British colonists and their native allies fought against French forces and their own native allies, particularly in the Ohio River Valley. The war ended with a decisive British victory formalized in the Treaty of Paris, 1763. France ceded Canada and its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain, which had allied with France, ceded Florida to Britain. In exchange, France transferred Louisiana to Spain. Britain now controlled vast new territories in North America but also faced enormous debts from the war. To raise revenue and assert greater control, the British government began enforcing existing trade laws and introducing new taxes. The Proclamation of 1763 restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, angering land-hungry settlers. The Sugar Act, 1764. Stamp Act, 1765, and Townshend Acts, 1767, imposed new taxes on goods and legal documents. Colonists responded with protests, boycotts, and the formation of political groups. The idea of no taxation without representation became a rallying cry. Colonists argued that they should not be taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. Opposition grew in intensity. The Stamp Act Congress convened in 1765, uniting delegates from several colonies in opposition to British policies. In towns and cities, groups like the Sons of Liberty organized resistance, sometimes through violence and intimidation. Tensions escalated over the next several years. In 1770, British soldiers fired on colonists in Boston during a confrontation later known as the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed, and the event was widely publicized and politicized. Though the British repealed some of the taxes, they retained a duty on tea. In response, colonists staged the Boston Tea Party in 1773, dumping chests of imported tea into the harbor. The British government responded with the coercive acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These measures closed Boston Harbor, altered Massachusetts government, and allowed British officials to be tried elsewhere. Colonists viewed the acts as a direct threat to their rights and self-government. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They agreed to coordinate resistance and petitioned the king for redress. As tensions continued to mount, British troops attempted to seize colonial arms in Concord, Massachusetts in April 1775. Armed colonists resisted in nearby Lexington, and the skirmish marked the beginning of open conflict. Battles at Lexington and Concord were followed by a second meeting of the Continental Congress, which began managing the war effort. Though many delegates still hoped for reconciliation, the momentum toward independence grew. In 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense made a powerful case for full independence from Britain. On July 4th, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson. The document proclaimed that the colonies were free and independent states and justified the break from Britain by listing grievances against King George III. The American Revolutionary War continued for several more years. British forces captured major cities but struggled to control rural areas. Colonial forces under the command of George Washington used guerrilla tactics, and the war became one of attrition. France entered the war on the American side in 1778, providing crucial military and financial support. Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the conflict against Britain. The war culminated in 1781 with the Siege of Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis surrendered to a combined American and French force. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally ended the war and recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation's boundaries extended from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida. The Articles of Confederation adopted during the war provided the first framework for national government. However, the Articles created a weak central government with limited powers. Congress lacked the authority to tax or regulate commerce, and decisions required unanimous consent of the states. Economic instability, border disputes, and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, revealed the weaknesses of the system. Calls for reform led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia and drafted a new constitution. The document established a federal government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It created a system of checks and balances and provided for a bicameral legislature. After intense debate, the Constitution was ratified by the states in 1788 and went into effect in 1789. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president. The Bill of Rights, 10 amendments protecting individual liberties, was added in 1791 to address concerns about centralized power. The new government faced immediate challenges, including managing national debt, establishing a currency, and navigating foreign relations. Following the ratification of the Constitution and the inauguration of the first president in 1789, the United States began to organize its institutions and policies under the new federal system. The government established executive departments, including the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of War. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created the structure of the federal court system, including the Supreme Court. Economic policy became a key issue. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton introduced a financial program designed to stabilize public credit, establish a national bank, and encourage manufacturing. His proposals sparked opposition from those who favored agrarianism and states' rights, leading to the formation of political factions. These eventually evolved into the Federalist Party, supporting a strong central government, and the Democratic-Republican Party, advocating limited federal authority. The new government navigated foreign challenges as well. The French Revolution divided American opinion, and conflicts between Britain and France threatened U.S. neutrality. The 1794 Jay Treaty with Britain averted war but was unpopular with many citizens. The 1795 Pinckney's Treaty with Spain secured navigation rights on the Mississippi River and access to the port of New Orleans. Domestically, tensions flared during the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania, where farmers protested an excise tax on distilled spirits. The federal government responded by sending militia forces, demonstrating its ability to enforce laws. In 1796, George Washington declined a third term, setting a precedent for presidential succession. His farewell address warned against political factions and entangling foreign alliances. John Adams succeeded Washington but faced difficulties. The quasi-war with France, an undeclared naval conflict, tested diplomatic resolve. The controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, aimed at suppressing dissent, sparked backlash and were viewed as violations of civil liberties. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in a peaceful transfer of power, marking the rise of the Democratic-Republican Party. Jefferson's presidency was marked by the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the nation's territory by acquiring land from France. The Lewis and Clark expedition explored the new territory, mapping routes to the Pacific and recording information on geography, flora, fauna, and Native American tribes. Jefferson also sought to reduce the size of government and limit federal power, though he expanded executive authority to complete the land deal. Tensions with Britain resumed, particularly over maritime rights and the impressment of American sailors. The Embargo Act of 1807, intended to pressure European powers by halting American exports, hurt the domestic economy. James Madison, Jefferson's successor, inherited these issues. In 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain, initiating the War of 1812. Key battles occurred along the Canadian border, in the Great Lakes, and along the Atlantic coast. The British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, but were repelled at Baltimore, where the defense of Fort McHenry inspired the national anthem. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1814, restoring pre-war boundaries. The Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty, became a symbol of American resilience and boosted national pride. The war's outcome encouraged American manufacturing and weakened Native resistance in the Northwest. Following the war, the era of good feelings under President James Monroe was characterized by political unity and national expansion. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 warned European powers against further colonization in the Americas, asserting U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily settled sectional tensions by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state while banning slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel in the Louisiana Territory. The market economy expanded during this period. Canals, roads, and later railroads facilitated transportation. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean and spurred economic growth. Technological innovations such as the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, revolutionized agriculture, especially in the South, where cotton became a dominant export and slavery expanded. The rise of industrialization in the North brought new factory systems, particularly in textiles. Urbanization accelerated, and a wage labor economy developed. Immigration increased, particularly from Ireland and Germany, leading to demographic changes and social tension. Reform movements emerged, including temperance, public education, and the early stirrings of abolitionism. Andrew Jackson's election in 1828 marked the beginning of a new era in politics, often referred to as Jacksonian democracy. Jackson emphasized the common man, expanded suffrage to all white male adults, and opposed institutions seen as favoring elites, such as the National Bank. His presidency also saw the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands, culminating in the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Native Americans died. The 1830s and 1840s saw continued westward expansion. The concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, motivated settlers and policymakers. Texas, originally part of Mexico, declared independence in 1836 and was annexed by the U.S. in 1845. This led to the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, which resulted in a decisive U.S. victory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war and ceded a vast territory to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. This acquisition raised new questions about the expansion of slavery. The California Gold Rush of 1849 spurred rapid settlement and economic growth in the West. Political tensions increased as new territories were organized. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to address the slavery issue by admitting California as a free state, strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, and allowing popular sovereignty in some territories. However, these measures only delayed the growing sectional crisis. Transportation and communication continued to develop. Railroads expanded across the continent, and the telegraph enabled faster transmission of information. Industrialization deepened in the North, while the South remained largely agricultural and reliant on enslaved labor. The differences in economic systems, social structures, and political priorities between the North and South became increasingly pronounced. The abolitionist movement gained momentum, with activists publishing newspapers, organizing lectures, and helping enslaved people escape via the Underground Railroad. Notable figures included Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who became a prominent speaker and writer. Tensions over slavery intensified with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe and violent conflicts in Kansas following the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. As the 1850s progressed, political polarization deepened. The Whig Party collapsed and the Republican Party emerged, opposing the extension of slavery into the territories. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case, 1857, ruled that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories, inflaming Northern opposition. The nation moved closer to division as debates over slavery dominated politics. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, was elected president without winning any Southern electoral votes. His election prompted several Southern states to secede from the Union, beginning with South Carolina. By early 1861, the Confederate States of America had formed, setting the stage for civil war. In April 1861, the Civil War began when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal installation in South Carolina. The conflict soon spread as additional Southern states joined the Confederacy. The Union, composed of the Northern states and loyal border states, aimed to preserve the nation. The Confederacy sought independence to protect its way of life, which included the institution of slavery. The war unfolded over 4 years and included major battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. The Union employed a strategy of economic blockade, control of the Mississippi River, and invasion of Southern territory. The Confederacy relied on defense, hoping to outlast Northern will and gain foreign recognition. Despite initial successes, the South faced shortages of supplies, manpower, and industrial capacity. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. While it did not immediately liberate all enslaved individuals, it redefined the war's purpose and paved the way for the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery in 1865. African Americans joined the Union Army in large numbers, contributing significantly to the war effort. The war devastated the South's economy and infrastructure. Cities were destroyed, railroads dismantled, and agriculture disrupted. The North, in contrast, experienced economic expansion, supported by wartime production and infrastructure investment. The federal government increased its power, passed the first national income tax, and issued a national currency. The war ended in April 1865 with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Days later, President Lincoln was assassinated, and Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. The process of Reconstruction began, aimed at rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people into American society. Reconstruction policies were contentious. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. Federal troops occupied southern states to enforce these laws and oversee the creation of new state governments. During this period, African Americans held political office, established schools, and formed churches. However, resistance from white Southerners grew. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to undermine Reconstruction efforts. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised black citizens. Political disputes over the scope of Reconstruction culminated in the impeachment of President Johnson, who opposed many of Congress's initiatives. He was acquitted by one vote. In 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of the Compromise of 1877, ending Reconstruction. Southern states quickly enacted laws to reverse gains made by African Americans. The late 19th century saw rapid industrialization and economic growth, a period often referred to as the Gilded Age. Railroads expanded across the continent, linking rural areas to markets and fueling westward migration. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected the east and west coasts. New technologies, including the telephone, electric light, and mechanized manufacturing, transformed daily life and the economy. Corporations grew in size and influence. Industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance amassed vast fortunes. Their businesses operated at national scale, using vertical and horizontal integration to control markets. Laissez-faire capitalism and limited regulation allowed monopolies and trusts to dominate key industries. The labor force diversified as immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe arrived in large numbers. They settled in urban areas and worked in factories, mines, and railroads. Working conditions were often dangerous, wages low, and hours long. Labor unions began to form, including the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, advocating for better conditions, collective bargaining, and workers' rights. Strikes and labor disputes were common. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Haymarket Affair of 1886 illustrated the growing tensions between labor and capital. Employers used private security, police, and federal troops to suppress strikes. Public opinion on labor varied, with many associating unions with anarchism and violence. Urbanization increased dramatically. Cities grew as centers of industry and immigration. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace, leading to overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and limited public services. Political machines such as Tammany Hall in New York City offered services in exchange for votes, fostering corruption and patronage. The federal government promoted westward expansion through policies like the Homestead Act of 1862, which granted land to settlers willing to cultivate it. Land-grant colleges were established to promote education in agriculture and engineering. Western settlement often came at the expense of Native American tribes, who were forcibly relocated, confined to reservations, or killed in military conflicts. The Indian Wars, including events like the Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876, and the Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890, marked the violent end of Native American resistance. The Dawes Act of 1887 aimed to assimilate Native Americans by allotting land to individuals and encouraging them to adopt farming, but it resulted in loss of tribal lands and cultural disruption. Social and political reform movements gained momentum. The Populist Party emerged in the 1890s, representing the interests of farmers and advocating for monetary reform, railroad regulation, and direct election of senators. The Grange and other agricultural organizations sought to address falling crop prices, debt, and unfair treatment by railroads and banks. Racial segregation and discrimination were entrenched during this period. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, upheld the constitutionality of separate but equal facilities, legitimizing Jim Crow laws. African Americans in the South faced systematic disenfranchisement, violence, and limited economic opportunity. Education expanded, though inequalities persisted. Public schools became more common, but resources varied widely by region and race. Higher education institutions increased in number, particularly in the North and Midwest. Scientific and cultural achievements progressed, with developments in medicine, engineering, and literature reflecting broader national changes. The closing of the frontier, as declared by the Census Bureau in 1890, signaled the end of a major chapter in U.S. history. The frontier had played a key role in American identity, shaping ideas of individualism, opportunity, and expansion. With the continent settled, attention turned increasingly to international affairs and industrial modernization. The U.S. began to engage more assertively abroad. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point. Following the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Spain. The brief conflict resulted in U.S. acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba gained independence under American oversight. The annexation of Hawaii in 1898 and the occupation of the Philippines sparked debates about imperialism. Proponents argued for spreading American values and accessing new markets. Opponents warned against undermining democratic principles and entangling the U.S. in foreign conflicts. The war marked the U.S.'s emergence as a global power. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States underwent a period of social, political, and economic reform known as the Progressive Era. This movement emerged in response to the rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social inequality of the Gilded Age. Reformers sought to address problems related to labor, health, education, government corruption, and monopolies. Muckraking journalists played a key role in raising awareness. Writers such as Ida Tarbell exposed corporate abuses, while Upton Sinclair's The Jungle revealed unsanitary practices in the meatpacking industry, prompting public outcry. These reports led to federal legislation, including the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both passed in 1906 to improve consumer safety and industry regulation. Political reforms included the introduction of the initiative, referendum, and recall to give citizens more direct influence over legislation. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, provided for the direct election of U.S. senators. The progressive movement also promoted women's suffrage, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. Presidents during this era implemented various reform agendas. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley, pursued trust-busting policies to break up large monopolies and established national parks and conservation programs. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission and introduced consumer protections. William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, continued some progressive policies but clashed with reformers over tariffs and conservation. Roosevelt later challenged Taft by running for president again in 1912 under the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. This split the Republican vote, allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win the election. Wilson's presidency included financial and labor reforms. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a central banking system to regulate currency and credit. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened laws against monopolistic practices. The Federal Trade Commission was established to monitor business practices. Wilson also supported labor rights, including the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. During this period, the U.S. continued to expand its global influence. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, facilitating trade and military movement. The U.S. intervened in Latin American countries under the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting the right to act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. As tensions escalated in Europe, World War I began in 1914. Initially, the U.S. remained neutral, though it traded with Allied powers. German unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 increased tensions. The revelation of the Zimmermann Telegram in 1917, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., further turned public opinion. In April 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany. The country mobilized rapidly, instituting the draft and converting industries for wartime production. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, arrived in Europe in 1917 and played a crucial role in the final offensives of 1918. American troops helped turn the tide in battles such as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. At home, the war effort led to economic growth and social change. Women and minorities entered the workforce in large numbers. The federal government promoted food conservation, war bonds, and patriotic messaging. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 limited dissent, leading to arrests and convictions for anti-war speech. The war ended with the armistice on November 11, 1918. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formally ended the conflict. President Wilson proposed a League of Nations to prevent future wars, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and the U.S. did not join the League. The war left Europe devastated and contributed to political instability. Domestically, the post-war period was marked by upheaval. A brief economic recession was followed by inflation and labor strikes in 1919. The first Red Scare reflected fears of communism and radicalism, especially after the Russian Revolution. Immigrants and political activists were arrested or deported in government raids. Prohibition, established by the 18th Amendment in 1920, banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. Enforcement proved difficult, leading to the rise of organized crime and speakeasies. The Volstead Act provided enforcement mechanisms, but widespread public disregard made the law controversial and ineffective. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, were a time of economic prosperity and cultural change. Mass production techniques, especially in the automobile industry, revolutionized manufacturing. Consumer goods such as radios, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners became common. Advertising and installment buying encouraged consumerism. The stock market expanded rapidly, and speculation became widespread. The wealth gap widened, and much of the economic growth was built on unstable foundations. While urban areas experienced modernity and cultural development, rural communities remained largely traditional. The decades saw clashes over immigration, religion, and morality. The Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas that restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and excluded Asians entirely. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a resurgence, promoting white supremacy and targeting Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Public debates over evolution culminated in the 1925 Scopes trial, symbolizing the conflict between science and religion. African American cultural expression flourished in the Harlem Renaissance, centered in New York City. Writers, artists, and musicians gained national attention, and jazz music became popular. Despite cultural achievements, racial discrimination persisted. Race riots occurred in cities such as Chicago and Tulsa, where black communities were attacked and destroyed. Women's roles changed significantly. The image of the flapper reflected new freedoms in dress and behavior. Women increasingly participated in the workforce and higher education, although traditional expectations remained strong. The feminist movement shifted toward legal and workplace equality after achieving suffrage. By the end of the decade, economic warning signs appeared. Agricultural prices had fallen throughout the 1920s, and many farmers were in debt. Consumer credit expanded rapidly, and banks made speculative loans. The stock market reached unsustainable highs. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the market crashed, triggering a global economic crisis. The stock market crash of October 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, the most severe economic downturn in U.S. history. Stock values plummeted, investor confidence collapsed, and banks failed across the country. In the early 1930s, industrial production declined by nearly 50%, unemployment rose to 25%, and millions of Americans lost their savings and homes. Agriculture suffered especially. Overproduction and falling prices had already weakened the sector, and the Dust Bowl of the mid-1930s worsened conditions. Severe drought and poor farming practices turned the Great Plains into a region of blowing dust and failed crops. Many farming families left for other regions, particularly California, in search of work. The federal government initially struggled to respond. President Herbert Hoover favored limited government intervention, emphasizing voluntary cooperation and local relief. His policies, including the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, were seen as inadequate in addressing widespread suffering. Shantytowns called Hoovervilles sprang up across the country, symbolizing public discontent. In 1932, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won a landslide victory by promising a New Deal for the American people. Upon taking office in 1933, he launched a series of government programs aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. His administration used radio addresses, known as fireside chats, to communicate directly with the public and restore confidence. The first New Deal, 1933 to 1934, focused on immediate relief. The Emergency Banking Act stabilized the financial system, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insured bank deposits. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided jobs on public projects. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed to raise farm prices by reducing crop production. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, sought to stabilize industry by regulating prices and wages. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, brought electricity and development to a poor region. However, some of these initiatives faced legal challenges. In 1935, the Supreme Court struck down the NIRA as unconstitutional, prompting a second wave of New Deal legislation. The Second New Deal, 1935 to 1938, included the Social Security Act, which established pensions for the elderly, unemployment insurance, and aid to families with children. The National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, guaranteed the right to unionize and collectively bargain. The Fair Labor Standards Act set minimum wages and maximum working hours. While the New Deal programs provided relief and transformed the role of government, they did not fully end the Depression. Economic growth remained slow through the 1930s. Conservatives criticized the New Deal for expanding government power, while some on the left believed it did not go far enough. Roosevelt faced opposition from business leaders, the Supreme Court, and populist figures like Huey Long. International tensions increased in the late 1930s. In Europe, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler pursued aggressive expansion. Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Japan expanded into China. The U.S. maintained a policy of isolationism reflected in the Neutrality Acts. Nevertheless, Roosevelt began preparing for potential conflict by increasing military production and aid to allies. World War II began in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. The U.S. remained officially neutral but provided aid to Britain and the Soviet Union through programs like Lend-Lease. In December 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, prompting a declaration of war. Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. shortly afterward. The U.S. mobilized rapidly for war. Millions of men were drafted or volunteered for military service. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories and offices. The war effort led to full employment, rising wages, and increased industrial production. War bonds and rationing helped finance the conflict and conserve resources. The federal government expanded dramatically. Agencies coordinated production, controlled prices, and directed resources. Scientific research advanced, including the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. Internment camps were established for Japanese Americans under Executive Order 9066, a policy later recognized as unjust. American forces fought in multiple theaters. In Europe, they participated in the North African Campaign, the invasion of Italy, and the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. In the Pacific, the U.S. pursued a strategy of island hopping, capturing key positions and moving closer to Japan. Major battles included Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Victory in Europe came in May 1945 following Germany's surrender. President Roosevelt had died in April and Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency. In August 1945, after Japan refused to surrender, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after, ending World War II. The war had far-reaching effects. Over 400,000 Americans died and millions more served. The U.S. emerged as a global superpower with a strong economy and advanced military. The war effort brought lasting social changes, including expanded roles for women and minorities, although full equality remained elusive. The post-war period marked the beginning of the Cold War as tensions rose between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Competing ideologies, capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism, led to global rivalries. Europe was divided, with the Eastern Bloc under Soviet control. Germany was split and the Iron Curtain became a symbol of division. The United Nations was established in 1945 to promote peace and cooperation. The U.S. played a leading role in its creation and hosted its headquarters in New York. American foreign policy shifted toward containment of communism, with efforts to rebuild Europe and counter Soviet influence. The Marshall Plan provided economic aid to Western Europe, helping to rebuild war-torn economies and prevent communist uprisings. The Truman Doctrine pledged U.S. support for countries resisting communism, first applied in Greece and Turkey. NATO, a military alliance formed in 1949, committed member nations to mutual defense. At home, the economy boomed. Returning veterans received benefits through the GI Bill, including education, housing loans, and job training. Suburban development increased and consumer goods became widely available. The baby boom began, leading to rapid population growth. However, post-war prosperity was uneven. African Americans, women, and other marginalized groups faced continued discrimination. The civil rights movement gained momentum, particularly with challenges to segregation and inequality. The stage was set for significant social and political change in the decades to follow. In the early 1950s, the United States focused on containing communism at home and abroad. The Cold War shaped every aspect of American life, including foreign policy, domestic politics, education, science, and culture. The Soviet Union's successful test of a nuclear bomb in 1949 intensified fear of nuclear conflict. In response, the U.S. developed hydrogen bombs and expanded its defense capabilities. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was a direct military conflict stemming from Cold War tensions. When North Korea invaded South Korea, the U.S. led a United Nations coalition to repel the attack. The conflict ended in an armistice, with the Korean peninsula remaining divided at the 38th parallel. The war underscored the U.S. commitment to resisting communism through military intervention. Domestically, anti-communist sentiment led to political repression. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed widespread communist infiltration in the government, media, and entertainment industry. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated alleged subversive activities, and many individuals were blacklisted or lost jobs. This period, known as McCarthyism, eroded civil liberties and stoked national paranoia. Economic growth characterized the 1950s. The rise of suburbia, fueled by affordable housing and highway expansion, reshaped the American landscape. Consumer culture thrived with mass production of cars, appliances, and televisions. Advertising and marketing promoted ideals of prosperity and domestic comfort. Education expanded in response to the Cold War. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 prompted concern about American scientific competitiveness. The U.S. responded with the National Defense Education Act, increasing federal funding for math, science, and foreign languages. Space exploration became a new frontier for Cold War rivalry. The civil rights movement gained momentum during this time. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The ruling challenged decades of Jim Crow laws and sparked resistance in the South. The federal government began to intervene to enforce civil rights rulings. Activism intensified. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, led by African American citizens, challenged segregation in public transportation. Sit-ins, marches, and legal challenges became widespread tactics. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a prominent leader advocating nonviolent resistance. Organizations such as the NAACP, SCLC, and SNCC mobilized communities and pushed for federal legislation. Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all faced pressure to act on civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned segregation and discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected African Americans' right to vote by eliminating barriers like literacy tests and poll taxes. These laws marked significant milestones, though enforcement remained inconsistent. The 1960s also witnessed the escalation of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War began as a limited effort to support South Vietnam against Communist North Vietnam. Under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and later Nixon, U.S. involvement deepened. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 gave the president broad authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war. The war became increasingly unpopular. Television coverage of combat and rising American casualties turned public opinion. Anti-war protests erupted on college campuses and in major cities. The draft was heavily criticized for disproportionately affecting working-class and minority youth. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a large-scale attack by North Vietnamese forces, further eroded support. Social movements expanded in scope. The women's rights movement, building on earlier suffrage efforts, sought equality in employment, education, and reproductive rights. The publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan in 1963 helped spark second-wave feminism. The National Organization for Women Now was founded to advocate for policy change. Latino and Native American activists also organized for rights. The United Farm Workers, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, demanded better wages and conditions for agricultural workers. The American Indian Movement, AIM, protested government policies and fought for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation. The LGBTQ+ rights movement emerged in response to discrimination and violence. The Stonewall Uprising in 1969, following a police raid on a gay bar in New York City, marked a turning point. It inspired annual Pride events and increased visibility and activism for equal rights. Cultural changes accompanied political activism. The counterculture rejected traditional norms in favor of alternative lifestyles, communal living, and artistic experimentation. Music, literature, and film reflected these values. The Summer of Love in 1967 and the Woodstock Festival in 1969 became symbols of youth rebellion and anti-establishment sentiment. Assassinations shocked the nation. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 in Dallas. His brother Robert F. Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated in 1968. These events intensified national divisions and led to political and social unrest. The 1970s brought further challenges. Economic problems emerged, including inflation, unemployment, and stagnation, often called stagflation. The U.S. experienced energy crises in 1973 and 1979, caused in part by conflicts in the Middle East and decisions by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, to restrict oil supplies. Environmental awareness grew. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was created the same year, and laws such as the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act aimed to regulate pollution and protect natural resources. Public concern over nuclear energy, toxic waste, and conservation continued to rise. Political trust declined during the Watergate scandal. In 1972, operatives connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into Democratic headquarters. Subsequent investigations revealed widespread abuse of power and attempts to obstruct justice. In 1974, facing near-certain impeachment, Nixon resigned. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency and later issued a controversial pardon. Foreign policy continued to evolve. The U.S. withdrew from Vietnam in 1973 after a peace agreement, though fighting resumed until the fall of Saigon in 1975. Nixon pursued détente with the Soviet Union, leading to arms control agreements like SALT I. He also visited China in 1972, opening diplomatic relations with the communist nation after decades of isolation. Cultural and demographic shifts reshaped the nation. Immigration increased, particularly from Latin America and Asia, following changes to immigration law in 1965. Suburban growth continued, while cities faced challenges like poverty, crime, and declining infrastructure. Television became the dominant medium for news and entertainment, influencing public opinion and culture. As the 1970s ended, Americans faced uncertainty about the economy, global influence, and national identity. Political realignment began to take shape, setting the stage for the conservative resurgence of the 1980s and new debates over the role of government, values, and America's place in the world. The 1980s began with a shift toward political conservatism. In 1980, Republican Ronald Reagan was elected president, defeating incumbent Jimmy Carter. Reagan's platform emphasized smaller government, lower taxes, free market economics, strong national defense, and traditional social values. His election reflected a growing backlash against liberal policies, economic stagnation, and perceived cultural decline. Reagan's economic agenda, known as Reaganomics, aimed to stimulate growth through tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending on social programs. The theory of supply-side economics held that lowering taxes would encourage investment, expand the economy, and increase federal revenue. While the economy eventually recovered from recession, income inequality widened, and the national debt grew substantially. The administration reduced environmental and labor regulations, while cutting funding for welfare, education, and public housing. Defense spending increased sharply, contributing to a budget deficit but also fueling the arms race with the Soviet Union. Reagan pursued a confrontational foreign policy early in his presidency, referring to the USSR as the evil empire and supporting anti-communist movements worldwide. In Latin America, the U.S. backed right-wing governments and rebel groups, often secretly. The Iran-Contra affair, revealed in the late 1980s, involved the covert sale of arms to Iran to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite a congressional ban. The scandal damaged the Reagan administration but resulted in few lasting consequences. Social issues remained contentious. The AIDS epidemic emerged in the early 1980s, prompting activism and public health debates. Reagan's administration was criticized for its slow response. Meanwhile, the war on drugs expanded, emphasizing law enforcement and incarceration, disproportionately impacting minority communities. The Cold War entered its final phase. Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985 and introduced reforms such as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Reagan and Gorbachev held several summits, leading to agreements on arms reduction, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, in 1987. These developments eased tensions between the superpowers. In 1989, Communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to collapse. The Berlin Wall fell in November, symbolizing the end of the Cold War division. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the formal end of the Cold War. The United States emerged as the sole global superpower. Domestically, the economy continued to grow through the late 1980s, but a recession hit in the early 1990s. George H. W. Bush, elected president in 1988, faced economic challenges despite foreign policy successes. In 1990 to 1991, the U.S. led a coalition in the Gulf War to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The swift military victory improved U.S. standing, but the war's aftermath raised concerns about long-term involvement in the Middle East. Bush's decision to raise taxes, despite a campaign promise not to, eroded support. In 1992, Democrat Bill Clinton was elected president. His administration emphasized centrist policies, economic modernization, and social reform. The 1990s saw strong economic growth, low inflation, and technological innovation, especially in computing and telecommunications. Clinton enacted policies including welfare reform, budget balancing, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which created a trade bloc with Canada and Mexico. Critics argued that free trade led to job losses in manufacturing, even as consumers benefited from lower prices and increased imports. Technology transformed the economy and culture. The internet became commercially available, reshaping communication, commerce, and media. Personal computers and mobile phones spread widely. New industries emerged, and stock markets boomed, particularly during the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s. Socially, debates over health care, gun control, and morality persisted. Clinton proposed a universal health care plan, which failed amid political opposition. Violence such as the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing and the 1999 Columbine school shooting raised concerns about domestic terrorism and youth culture. Cultural polarization increased as partisan media gained influence. Clinton's presidency was marked by scandal. Allegations of misconduct culminated in impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998, related to a sexual relationship with a White House intern and charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate acquitted him, and he completed his term with high approval ratings. In 2000, Republican George W. Bush was elected president after a disputed election that hinged on the state of Florida. The Supreme Court's decision in Bush versus Gore ended a recount and effectively awarded the presidency to Bush. His administration began with a focus on tax cuts, education reform, and domestic policy. Everything changed on September 11, 2001. Coordinated terrorist attacks by the Islamist group Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. The attacks shocked the nation and the world, marking the beginning of a new era in American history centered on national security and global conflict. In the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks, the United States initiated a broad campaign known as the War on Terror. The immediate response included the authorization of military force by Congress and the launch of Operation Enduring Freedom, beginning with the invasion of Afghanistan. The goal was to dismantle Al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and prevent future terrorist attacks. The U.S. led a coalition of NATO and international partners in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was overthrown quickly, but insurgency and instability persisted. U.S. forces remained engaged in combat, reconstruction, and nation-building efforts for years, with growing challenges related to governance, corruption, and ongoing violence. The domestic response included the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the passage of the USA Patriot Act, and the restructuring of intelligence and security agencies. Airport security tightened, surveillance expanded, and counterterrorism operations became central to federal policy. Civil liberties organizations raised concerns about privacy and due process. In 2003, the U.S. expanded the war on terror by invading Iraq. The stated rationale was that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat. Although no such weapons were found, the U.S. removed Hussein from power and attempted to establish a democratic government. The occupation led to sectarian violence, the rise of insurgent groups, and long-term instability. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated foreign policy and strained military resources. Public support initially was high but declined as casualties mounted and strategic objectives remained elusive. The financial cost of the wars exceeded trillions of dollars, and debates over U.S. global responsibilities intensified. Domestically, the mid-2000s were marked by economic expansion and then severe crisis. The housing market grew rapidly, fueled by risky mortgage practices and financial speculation. In 2007, the housing bubble burst, triggering the global financial crisis known as the Great Recession. Major banks faced collapse, credit markets froze, and unemployment soared. In 2008, Republican President George W. Bush authorized emergency measures, including the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, to stabilize the banking system. Meanwhile, the presidential election that year resulted in the historic victory of Democrat Barack Obama, who became the first African-American president. He ran on a platform of hope, change, and economic recovery. Upon taking office in 2009, Obama faced the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. His administration passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a stimulus package aimed at creating jobs, supporting industries, and funding infrastructure. The auto industry was bailed out, and interest rates were kept low to encourage lending. Financial reform followed, including the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which aimed to increase oversight of the banking industry and prevent future crises. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was established to monitor lending and financial practices. Recovery was slow but steady, with the economy gradually stabilizing by the mid-2010s. Healthcare reform was a major initiative of the Obama administration. After prolonged debate, the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare, passed in 2010. It aimed to expand health insurance coverage, prevent discrimination based on pre-existing conditions, and reduce costs. The ACA faced legal challenges and political opposition but remained largely intact. Obama also emphasized education, clean energy, and environmental protection. Initiatives supported renewable energy development, emissions reduction, and technological innovation. The administration joined international climate efforts, including the Paris Agreement, to combat global warming. Environmental regulations sparked debate between supporters of climate action and critics who saw them as harmful to business. Civil rights issues came to the forefront. The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell allowed LGBTQ+ individuals to serve openly in the military. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that same-sex marriage was legal nationwide. These decisions reflected changing public attitudes and ongoing advocacy for equality. Race and policing became central issues following several high-profile deaths of African Americans in encounters with law enforcement. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and others led to protests and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Calls for police reform, racial justice, and systemic change became widespread. Foreign policy continued to evolve. In 2011, U.S. forces located and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. The operation was a symbolic and strategic victory in the war on terror. However, new threats emerged, particularly from ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which gained territory and influence in the Middle East beginning in 2014. The U.S. responded with airstrikes and military support for regional forces. The Syrian civil war, refugee crises, and complex alliances created ongoing foreign policy challenges. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts led to the Iran nuclear deal aimed at limiting Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons in exchange for lifting sanctions. The Obama administration faced growing political polarization. The 2010 midterm elections resulted in a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, making it difficult to pass legislation. Gridlock and partisanship characterized much of the political environment. Debates over immigration, gun control, and federal spending intensified. The Tea Party movement emerged as a conservative response to federal expansion and perceived overreach. It played a key role in reshaping the Republican Party and influencing electoral outcomes. Executive orders and administrative actions became more common as legislative compromise waned. By the mid-2010s, technology and social media had transformed communication, politics, and civic engagement. Platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube enabled rapid information sharing but also spread misinformation, polarized discourse, and amplified extremist views. Concerns about privacy, data security, and digital manipulation grew. The 2016 presidential election reflected the deep divisions in American society. Economic anxiety, cultural conflict, and distrust in institutions shaped the political climate. The contest between Democrat Hillary Clinton and Republican Donald Trump was one of the most contentious in modern history. Donald Trump won the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, becoming the 45th president. His victory signaled a shift in American politics with a focus on nationalism, populism, deregulation, and disruption of established norms. The election highlighted concerns about foreign interference, media influence, and the resilience of democratic systems. The presidency of Donald Trump began in January 2017, marked by significant political and social upheaval. His administration pursued an agenda focused on deregulation, tax cuts, immigration restrictions, and reshaping the judiciary. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 lowered corporate and individual tax rates, aiming to stimulate economic growth. Trump emphasized an America First approach to foreign policy, questioning long-standing alliances and trade agreements. He withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Iran nuclear deal. The administration renegotiated NAFTA into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Immigration policies became more restrictive, with measures such as travel bans targeting several majority Muslim countries and increased border enforcement. Family separations at the southern border drew domestic and international criticism. The Supreme Court upheld many Trump-era policies, shaping legal precedents. Social and political polarization intensified. Public discourse was marked by frequent controversies, including debates over misinformation, media trust, and institutional legitimacy. Impeachment proceedings were initiated twice against Trump. First in 2019 over Ukraine-related allegations, and later in 2021 following the January 6th Capitol attack. He was acquitted by the Senate both times. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in early 2020, posed an unprecedented public health crisis. The U.S. experienced widespread infection and death, economic disruption, and challenges in coordinating responses at federal, state, and local levels. Vaccination campaigns began in late 2020, but the pandemic exposed deep social and political divides. The 2020 presidential election saw Democrat Joe Biden defeat Trump. The transition period was fraught with contestation, culminating in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot by supporters of the outgoing president. This event raised concerns about democratic stability and political violence. Biden's administration focused on pandemic response, economic recovery, climate change, and social equity. Legislation included stimulus packages to support individuals and businesses, infrastructure investments, and efforts to address systemic racism and voting rights. Foreign policy emphasized re-engagement with allies and multilateral institutions. Contemporary America continues to grapple with complex challenges: economic inequality, racial justice, political polarization, technological change, and environmental threats. Demographic shifts, including increased diversity and changing population dynamics, influence social and political life. The nation's history, shaped by conflict, innovation, migration, and ideals, remains a subject of ongoing debate and reinterpretation. Discussions about the meaning of democracy, the role of government, and the pursuit of equality persist amid changing domestic and global contexts.